This is the Leadership Podcast, and we study leaders. This is episode 479, featuring Siri Chilazi, senior researcher at the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you for joining us today. This is Jim Vasilopoulos, founder of Rafty Advisors, and this is the Leadership Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Jan Rutherford, founder of Self-Reliant Leadership. Thanks for making us part of your day as we study leaders. And you know where to find all our past episodes. It's at theleadershippodcast.com. And we just started doing videos. So we've got a YouTube channel as well. So check it out, please.
Yeah, and subscribe. And speaking of people you should subscribe to the wisdom of the people at Darley. They're wonderful people. It's a wonderful company located in America's Midwest. They have a mission that supports all our military and first responders with the equipment they need to ensure mission success, whether that's a water pump, a drone, emergency medical supplies, whatever you need. I'll learn more about this wonderful company and the people supporting our nation's heroes at darley.com. That's DARLEY.com. Darley, you serve others, we serve you.
Thanks, Jim. And our guest today is Siri Chilazi. She's an internationally recognized gender equality expert and co-author of Make Work Fair, Data-Driven Design for Real Results. It came out just recently, and it's all about sharing practical evidence-based advice for embedding fairness and gender equity into how we work. And we're excited that it's evidence-based. And I know you're also a senior researcher at the Women and Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School, and you help a lot of different organizations bridge the gap between research and practice. So we're excited to have you. Your work's been featured in New York Times, Harvard, BBC, Forbes, Fast Company, and many more. Siri, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jan and Jim. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So
on episode 479. Wow, congratulations.
Yeah.
Woof.
So you probably can't tell on the video, but Jim actually has his hand on my back and he's making me ask this question. Siri, how do you like your name?
I love it. I love it. What can I say? Actually, having the Apple Siri has made my life easier in a lot of respects. You know, people remember it now. They know how to spell it. If I'm making reservations over the phone, they never forget it. So I'm not complaining.
Yeah, it doesn't get tiresome.
I don't really have a choice, right?
Yeah.
But no, it doesn't really get tiresome. Unfortunately, it gets tiresome for other people when I join a Zoom meeting and they say, "Oh, hey, Siri," and then their own Apple devices, pipe up in the background. So I always say, "I'm so sorry."
Oh, that's
Once already.
I don't have Hey Siri turned on. My Siri is a woman with an Irish accent.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So we're happy to have you. We're happy to have your energy. Let's just start off with talking about fairness at work, that it isn't about changing people. It's a little bit about redesigning systems. So, I always think, when we approach problems, there's the brute force. Let's, make people behave a different way. And then there's, well, why are people behaving this way to begin with? What's going on with the system, the environment? Can we just talk about that from a fairness perspective versus, there's good people and bad people and you should and all the shoulds? Let's go there.
Great place to start. My co-author Iris and I are both behavioral scientists. So our obsession is exactly what you just said. Why do humans behave the way they behave? Not according to theoretical models, but actually. And then if we want to change those behaviors, our own or other people's behaviors, how do we go about doing that?
Yeah.
And some of the core insights that we've gleaned from all the research in behavioral science, psychology, neuropsychology, economics, all these fields, is that our behaviors are often shaped by the environments that surround us, right? The physical environments, but also the policies, the processes, the norms, the stereotypes, the culture, so to speak. And those external forces shape us to a much greater degree than we realize. And it turns out that if we want to shift behaviors, it's much faster, easier, often cheaper, and most importantly, much more effective to change that surrounding environment, those systems and processes, rather than to try to change our individual brains.
What would be an example of something you could change that would help people perceive that everything is more fair?
So let me give you a really personal example. In a prior life before becoming an academic, right out of college, I was a management consultant. And 6 months in, I'm the most junior member of the team, zero power, but I get invited to join the recruitment team for the summer interns. And I'm actually allowed to interview the summer intern candidates. Now, if I'd known back then what I know now about how to conduct the most objective, rigorous, unbiased interviews, let me tell you, I would have done them very differently. But these days, a lot of companies that recognize, maybe our hiring processes aren't the best, how could we make them more rigorous and objective? They turn to something like unconscious bias training. And they put their whole recruitment team through a workshop for an hour or 2 or 6, where they learn all these academic concepts about what is bias, and here's 10 different biases that might impact hiring. But then after the workshop, when it's time to actually interview the next set of candidates, they go back to that same unstructured process where they look at a person's resume and say, oh, wow, you went to the same school as I did, or you're from that same small town that my dad is from. And now we start to chit chat about that. And I love you because you come from the same town as my dad. And that has nothing to do with your competence. So that's what we're trying to fix people by changing their mindsets, giving them more information, raising their awareness. The much more effective structural approach would be to forget about the training and just make some tweaks to the hiring process itself. So for example, decide the questions that you're going to ask in advance. Ask all the candidates for a given role those same set of questions in the same order. And then when you're grading your candidates, when you're assessing the answers, let's say I interviewed 5 people, assess their answers to question 1 across all 5 candidates, then move on to question 2, comparatively evaluate their answers to question 2 against each other, and so on and so forth. Those are super small tweaks to the process, but they help our inherently biased brains to nonetheless make better decisions.
Yeah, I love that. And, I want to, real quick, I want a follow-up question is about the word fairness. And, we interviewed Kurt Gray recently. He wrote a book called Outrage, Why We Fight About Morality in Politics. And a lot of what he talked about was harm. And in my reading of his book and other books about psychology, that's one of the places where we humans fight the most. That if we perceive something's not fair. So, I mean, and again, that might be why, DEI's gotten beat up. I mean, it's all everybody's perspective on fair. Was that word very intentional that you use that word? I mean, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that choice was very intentional, and it was made long before the current moment, let me tell you.
Yeah.
Reason Iris and I settled on fairness, there's a couple reasons. One is there's a lot of research that shows that fairness is a universally shared human value globally, right? People gravitate to fairness. Kids as young as 4 and 5 years old develop a really sophisticated understanding of fairness. They react very strongly to displays of unfairness. So we felt like this could be the common value and the common ground from which to build. If we can pretty much largely agree that fairness is a desired state of the world, then we can have an evidence-based conversation about what works and what doesn't to move us toward fairness.
Yeah.
But the other reason we picked that is because, if I'm honest, I've been working with companies for a long time, speaking at conferences and events for a long time. And if you have words like women, gender equality, diversity, equity in the title of a session, who's going to self-select to be in that room if it's a voluntary opportunity? It's women, maybe people of color, right? Not the leaders, who often are not women or people of color, who actually make critical decisions that impact whether fairness is happening or not. But then when I do talk to these leaders and I say, well, do you care about running a high-performing organization? What's the key driver of your company's success? Oh, people. So this means you want to hire the right people into the right roles at the right time, and you want them to be doing their best work. Oh, this is what matters to you. That's fairness. It's actually impossible without fairness to spot talent accurately, to truly hire the best people, and then to evaluate those people objectively so that we make sure that we're advancing and promoting the best, most competent people rather than the ones who, for example, appear most confident on the surface. So the other reason for choosing fairness was because it just empirically has resonated with leaders as something that they recognize they need to care about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Jan, you'll have to, maybe you could figure this out. I was trying to figure it out there. We had another guest a long time ago, that wrote a book on like fairness, and it was really kind of interesting, that I thought was, really parallels this discussion. But what I really like though, like when we talked through like the first part of our discussion here, I think you hit on like intentionality and structure is a way to kind of say if we're intentional and we add some structure, and it doesn't have to be complicated. It's a way that we can add some fairness into our processes, into our hiring process, into our evaluation of people. Um, I know you talk a lot about in the book about data, and I'm really curious because I think that, rolls off the tongue and it's logical and people are like, of course data makes sense. Um, but we're notoriously bad at interpreting data and we're very unsophisticated and we make a lot of mistakes. Help us understand how that gets us into trouble and how we can do it right.
Yeah, it's such a great point, Jim, because one of the places where organizations have stumbled is they've kind of equated data collection to progress. They said, oh, yeah, 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 but we collect all this data and it languishes in some IT system or database somewhere that barely anyone ever looks at. And the point Iris and I make in the book that data can be a powerful engine for change, but only if we harness it as such, only if we actively make the data speak. So part of that is you need to not only collect data, but you need to actually analyze it to reveal insights around, where are there gaps in hiring and people's career advancement? Are certain groups of employees getting more or less feedback than others? Do some of them have more or less access to stretch assignments or the high visibility projects or the best accounts to work on that will then turbocharge their career advancement? It's also critical that data lands in the hands of the people who can use that data to help inform decisions. I think layoffs can actually be a great example of this. Microsoft, for example, about 10 years ago had a well-publicized instance where globally the representation of women at Microsoft declined several percentage points. And thankfully, Microsoft collects detailed data on their workforce, so they were able to pinpoint exactly why that happened. And long story short, they had recently acquired Nokia, which proportionally employed a lot more women than Microsoft did. And when they did some layoffs, they disproportionately closed former Nokia factories, and those layoffs affected Microsoft employees. And they just termed it a strategic business decision that was made in the long-term interest of the business. But my question there would be to all organizations, because there's actually a lot of research that shows that there are often disproportionate gender and racial impacts from layoffs. My question to organizations would be, my assumption is that you run some financial analysis before layoffs on, how many people should we fire, which people, is this going to save us money in the long run? Because there's also some short-term costs associated with firing people. So you don't think twice about collecting and analyzing that financial data and having that feed into your decision. Well, if we're serious about fairness, Iris and I suggest that we should approach fairness and manage it exactly the same way as we do our core business. So we should also run the analysis of if we close this factory, if we shut down this division, if we fire people based on, last hired, first fired, how is that going to impact our workforce demographics? And I'm not saying that should be the basis for the decision, but that should be one critical business factor among many that's considered as part of the decision.
Yeah.
That would be an example of using data as an engine for change and approaching it the same way we approach our core business.
So, I mean, I know I see that, and I know we do the financial analysis and we actually look at that data, but we kind of know what questions to ask in that realm. And I think so much of data analysis is, ignores data collection. And data collection is initiated by the questions we ask. And so I think demographics is probably one sliver, but I think it tends to be kind of a very kind of shallow accommodation for what we're trying to accommodate, trying to accomplish. What are the questions that you find people don't ask to collect better data that they should be asking?
That's an excellent question. So you're right. Some of the more surface level metrics like representation, things like pay gaps as a whole by gender, by race. Yes, very important, but pretty surface level. In a lot of organizations, what I see is that we've made a lot more progress in making hiring more fair and objective. But our next frontier that really requires a lot of work is career advancement. How do we make sure that we're actually spotting talent accurately where it exists, that we're developing our people fairly, which means everyone has an equal opportunity to do their best work and show what they're made of, and then we advance, of course, the best, most highly skilled people. So questions that I would ask here, data points that I might look at is, for example, feedback. Are women, men, employees in this division A versus the division B, do they on average get feedback write-ups that are the same length? Are they described using different words? Do some people report getting more feedback or more regular feedback than others? We could look at hard career advancement metrics like how long people spend on average at a given rank before they get promoted to the next rank. Do we here see systematic differences between, people's backgrounds, the schools that they went to, or the degrees that they came in with, or who their manager is, right? We all know that not all managers are equal. Some people are much better at developing others. So those would be really interesting questions to look at, again, to evaluate. Is our organization providing a genuinely level playing field, an equal opportunity for everybody to thrive? Or do some people get really lucky by having a wonderful manager, by working in a division where the culture is really conducive to their success? And then if by random chance you wind up in a different division with a different manager, tough luck.
Yeah. So you mentioned something about people that perform, spotting talent. A big discussion we have every single day is, the difference between performance and potential.
Yes.
Did any of your work involve, helping people understand the difference?
Yes, it does. This is actually a question that comes up frequently. So, as a researcher of bias, one of the things that concerns me here is that assessments of performance tend to be backward looking. So, by definition, there's some concrete data that we can go on, right? Some demonstrable evidence. By contrast, assessments of performance tend to be forward looking. We're projecting, we're making
Yeah.
projections, right? Or guesses about, what can this person do? Do we have confidence that they can take on X, Y, or Z, even though they haven't yet? And we often see that it's in these assessments of potential where bias tends to creep in, precisely because those assessments are more subjective and there's less formal data to go on. So this would be a place where if I was an organizational leader and we had a performance evaluation system that incorporated assessments of performance and potential, I'd want to look at both components and see whether we observe gaps between groups of employees where systematically, for example, men are found to have higher potential ratings than women, just as an example.
Yeah. Interesting. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was, training.
Mm,
We know that there's a lot of money spent on training, a lot of time,
so much money.
and they fall short. What have you found, and from the data perspective,
Yeah.
what's a better alternative to
I'm
just throwing
really,
training at things?
really glad you brought up training because this is a classic example of a domain where there's so much activity happening and very little of it is based on evidence. And we actually have really robust, rigorous evidence on the effects of diversity trainings of all different kinds, including unconscious bias training, because these trainings have been around since the 1960s. And they have been studied since the 1960s. So we now have more than half a century's worth of data, 500 studies that show that trainings basically don't shift people's behavior. People often subjectively love the trainings. They'll give it an 11 out of 10 on the score form, and they'll report that, oh, yes, I learned all these new things I didn't know before. I'm much more motivated now to make sure that, I don't evaluate people in a biased way. But then when we follow up with them and see what they actually do in 6 months, in 12 months, in 2 years, we just don't see evidence of behavior change. And it's because it's really difficult, maybe impossible, to rewire human brains. It goes back to where we started, right? About the environment and the decision-making sort of architecture that we surround ourselves with, having such huge power over the decisions that we actually make. So instead of investing all this money and time in training, trying to reprogram people's brains, a much more effective way would be to actually tackle the processes that govern how we make decisions. So let's go back to performance evaluations.
Yeah.
Research shows that when we make our performance evaluation prompts more specific and close-ended, it results in less biased and high-quality assessments. So instead of asking a manager an open-ended question like, comment on this person's performance over the last year, it would be better to have 2 or 3 short questions that say, what are this person's 2 greatest strengths that they need to double down on? Give specific behavioral examples of how and when they've demonstrated these strengths. What's this person's the single most critical development area? What is the skill or the competency that they need to cultivate to advance to the next level? What's the evidence that you've observed of why this is a development area? Give 2 or 3 specific suggestions for them on how to work on this. So being more specific and requiring those examples gives less room for bias to flourish.
Yeah. And again, gosh, this could be a rabbit hole, but I'm tracking with you. But every single person I work with can barely find the time to do anything. And like we talked about at the very beginning before we hit record. And the one thing lacking is, people that adequately know how to coach. I mean, to have those kind of discussions, to evaluate people as objectively as possible, and to tease out the self-discovery and the self-awareness in people.
Yeah.
These skills are not trained, and I would argue they can't be trained traditionally. They have to be trained through role plays, and
Right.
nobody likes to do role plays, and
job learning.
and not many people know how to teach role plays. So
Yeah.
you're kind of, did I go full circle back to, maybe they don't need the training on what you're saying, but they still need leadership training.
Yeah. And I totally understand why our brain first goes to training. By the way, my observation of the workplace aligns perfectly with yours. Very few people are good at coaching. Very few people are good people managers. Very few people know how to give really high quality feedback.
Yep.
But back to this idea that training is often not the most effective way to actually accomplish this. How might we design systems or prompts or reminders to help us be better at that, right? So maybe there's a calendar reminder that goes off on every Tuesday at noon that says, give feedback to one person on your team. Here's the 3 bullets you need to hit.
Yeah.
Once
These are like nudges,
Exactly. Nudges.
yeah.
Right, very concrete. What's one behavior that you have observed them doing this week that was really effective? Why? Right? What was the impact? So by changing kind of how we prompt people and what we ask them to do, that nudge in itself can be almost part of the training, right?
Yeah.
Because it is training them to deliver and structure the feedback in a specific way that we know is more effective.
Yes.
This is also an area where technology can be a huge aid, because technology can, for example, screen for biased words in assessment. And it can flag to managers, hey, you keep calling all your female direct reports, you comment on how nice and warm and collaborative they are. But to all these men, you're saying, oh, you're so analytical and you make great decisions and clients love you. Why is it that you're choosing to comment on such different things for different employees? Or an organization that I worked with a few years back had an issue where certain employees tended to get much longer reviews, as in more words, and other employees got shorter reviews. Well, again, technology can flag that so easily and say,
That's
hey,
right.
let's try to aim for roughly 300 words for everybody.
Yeah.
So it can help with accountability and almost be a training tool in itself.
This is great food for thought. Hey, before I toss it back over to Jem, just a reminder that we're enjoying our conversation today with Siri, thanks to the good folks at Darley, based in America's Midwest. Their company and the great people there support our first responders and military around the globe. So you can learn more about them at darley.com. That's DARLEY.com.
All right. Thanks, Jan. So in your book, you talk about the opt-out approach with regard to promotions. Tell us a little bit. I've got a lot of questions here, but tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
what that is, how it manifests itself in the workplace.
I'm so glad you brought this up because this is another great example of changing systems and re-examining how we've designed our workplaces instead of trying to change the people in the workplace. Most companies have a promotion system today that we would call opt-in, meaning either as the employee, you have to ask to be promoted, maybe your manager has to put you forward, but someone somewhere has to make a concrete step to say, please, let's promote this person. Now, we know from empirical research that there are differences in people's ability and willingness to self-promote, differences by gender, by race, by cultural context even. There's areas of the world where this kind of self-promotion, me, promote me, give me a raise, is just not viewed positively. So in order to level the playing field, researchers have tested what would happen if we moved in from this opt-in system to an opt-out system, where for a given role, we say that, everybody who's been in this role for 2 years, let's say, will automatically get evaluated for promotion. It doesn't mean that everyone will actually get promoted. You could also choose to opt out of that promotion evaluation, or your manager could opt you out with some kind of justification. But point is that we make sure that people don't fall through the cracks. And research, in fact, shows that this both helps to make decisions more objective and helps to increase women's rates of advancement. I want to share a quick story of another context in which this approach was life-changing, and it relates to the public school district of Broward County in Florida, which is the United States' 6th largest public school district, serving more than 250,000 learners. Like many places, they had a system for identifying what they called high IQ children in the first and second grade, where teachers or parents could refer students to be IQ tested. And if they scored above a certain cutoff, they got this high IQ designation that then put them on a path of advanced classes, more tailored individualized learning, a lot of extra support to foster their success. And then Broward County made a small but unbelievably impactful design change. They went from this opt-in system where parents or teachers had to refer to a system where all first and second graders were tested by default. They all took the exact same exam as before. The score cutoffs were not changed, but what happened is that the participation of students of color, especially Black and Hispanic students, went up dramatically. So the kids' IQ hadn't changed, right? But what changed was the system whereby we identified them. And this more equitable system was able to essentially uncover a large number of students that were previously overlooked, even though they were high IQ. So these designs really matter, and we are not always accurate judges of competence. We need to surround ourselves with smart systems that help us really see the high potential or the high capability where it actually resides.
That's a fantastic example and a great story. I really like that a lot. Thank you for bringing that to light, because it takes an academic concept or a concept and says, okay, here's how it works in practice. I think
Right.
that's powerful. We know, and I think, obviously you've done the research, that there's a big gap between like men and women opting in. Like men will opt in with like one qualification out of 5 that are mandatory, and women will only opt in when they have all 5 boxes checked. And that's just kind of kind of one of these things that happens from my understanding. So we go to an opt-out approach and it hopefully fixes that. But what about like, that's a process, but there's something like in people, based on the data set I threw out there with like how men and women opt in, that might still have people feeling like, I'm not worthy, I'm not ready. And I think the difference between, let's say, a job promotion and let's say the Broward County is, the Broward County had a test and the test said you are ready. There's whether it or
Right.
not, you are ready. There's still a self-determination, and even in an opt-out that says like, do I want to really pursue this or not?
Yeah.
Do I feel like I'm ready, or do I feel like I don't want to screw this up because I don't feel like I'm ready. Whereas there's a risk taker maybe that checks one box and says, oh, what the hell? Let's do it. How do we bridge that gap with people?
Excellent question. And I want to point out in promotions and in the workplace more generally, we often confuse confidence with competence. So just because someone's pounding the table, applying for everything, saying, me, I'm ready, give me a raise, promote me, put me on this project, that doesn't mean that they're actually the most skilled or competent person for that task. But to your question of how do we fix this, one potent lever is transparency of information, or put it differently, reduction of ambiguity. There's actually a fantastic study that looked at one of the largest employers in Australia, which identified exactly the gap that you brought up, Jim. They found that internal candidates, people who were already employed by this organization, were applying to leadership positions. Among those candidates who weren't selected, men were almost twice as likely to reapply for another leadership opening in the future. And of course, from the organization's point of view, this was a loss because these are high potential candidates. They've already been vetted. Only one person could get that one job, but they want to keep these people in the pool. So they reduced ambiguity by sending those rejected candidates an email that said, we're sorry you didn't get the job this time, but you were in the top 20% of applicants. There are many other openings, so please reapply in the future. And telling them that little piece of information that they were in the top 20% closed the gender gap in reapplications.
That's great.
Because it gave people more clarity on, oh, wow, if I'm in the top 20%, it's worth it for me to invest time and effort in a new application because I actually have a realistic chance of maybe getting it. Whereas in the absence of that information, you have no idea where you stand. You might fall more prey to those stereotypes or those expectations of, oh my gosh, I probably don't cut it. It's not even worth it to reapply.
In the book, you have a 3-part framework. I'd love for you to share a little bit about that with our audience. Make it count, make it stick, make it normal.
And make it normal. That's right. So Iris and I explained that making work fair is everybody's job. We can't outsource this to a single HR professional or to a single chief diversity officer because all of us every day are making these daily decisions about what to write in an email, who should speak in the meeting, who should I get advice from, who should I give feedback to, and what should the feedback be, who should I promote, all these decisions. And so the 3-part framework is intended to guide people on how to actually put fairness into practice. Making it count is all about using the same data-driven tools to manage fairness that we use to manage our core business. So we're tracking data points, we're setting goals. We often have financial incentives in place to help us achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves. And then we keep tracking and sharing data to make sure that it's actually moving in the right direction, that we're on track to meet those goals. So we should manage our efforts to make work fair in the same way. Making fairness stick is in the vein of opting out, right? Or in the vein of reducing ambiguity. It's making small tweaks to the things that we're already doing. So there's no need to start a whole new program or big initiative or kick up a training program, but just do the things that you're already doing a little bit better. So, for example, if you're trying to get more voices heard in a meeting, maybe you just have a rule of thumb that at some point in the meeting, we go through a round robin and we give everybody 2 minutes to speak to make sure that folks actually get a chance to have their voice heard. It can be simple, it can be small tweaks, but they're very powerful. And then lastly, making it normal is about embedding fairness into all the everyday interactions that aren't necessarily a formal process like hiring or formal policy like parental leave or vacation time, but those small everyday actions. And one of my favorite concepts here is something called norm entrepreneurship. Norms, of course, are the shared but often unspoken understandings that we have about what kind of behavior is okay and what kind of behavior is not acceptable in a given context. And norms are actually surprisingly malleable. So each of us, by our own example of how we behave, but also by choosing what we tolerate from others, right? Like what we tackle, what we reward, what we call people out for, can shape and create the norms that we want to see and then uphold them. So that's an example of making fairness normal every day.
Yeah. What do you What do you think is the biggest resistance to, what you just pitched? I'm curious.
It's a great question. In my experience working with organizations, senior leaders especially, but I think this applies up and down the organizational hierarchy, it's very easy to support something at arm's length that doesn't influence you directly. So sure, I'll write a big check and we'll have these researchers come in and study something. Or yes, I'm going to sign up to be an ally for the Women's Network and, once a quarter, I'm going to attend an event, right? Those are kind of easy, discrete things to sign on to support. But when it's, let's change your compensation scheme, let's change your bonus, let's change the criteria that you're going to use to promote people on your team, that's the moment when it starts to touch your own everyday work, right? Where it becomes personal for you. That's often where we see resistance.
Yeah.
Not always,
Yeah.
but I think those
I
are the
can see
moments
that.
where resistance is more likely to rear its head.
Yeah. I
But
want to
we
kind of
can't
touch
get change without change, right?
I want to touch on resistance a little bit because that's kind of where our world is right now. So, like, this is a delightful discussion. Everything you're saying just makes sense. It's right. It's fair. And I just want to kind of, put a thought in people's minds. If you're listening to this and then I said, this is a DEI discussion, would your opinions change? Would your opinion of what we're talking about change? Or, and how would it change? And I just think, we're in this polarized time right now. And, right or wrong, I think there have been some practitioners of DEI who've probably gone about it wrong. But it doesn't mean that the idea is wrong. For someone who's in this field right now, how are you dealing with probably headwinds? And, how do you see this playing out?
I love that you use the phrase common sense because that's actually one of my favorite pieces of feedback to receive from people on the book tour and from readers. I think of one event that I did, and some members that work for a branch of the US government were in attendance because their friend was the organizer of the event. So they weren't there voluntarily, which they told me. But they came up to me after the event and they said, listen, we didn't expect to agree with anything you'd have to say, but we came to support our friend who organized this event. And we just have to tell you, this makes so much sense. And I mean, I just wanted to burst with joy right in that moment because one of Iris's and my core aspirations with our research and also with our book is to bring these discussions about fairness, to shift them from the realm of ideology and emotion to the realm of data and evidence. And just to say, smart businesses understand that we need a lot of different people working here, a lot of different perspectives, experiences, skills represented. And diversity by itself isn't a magic formula, right? It's not enough to have 10, diverse perspectives represented in a room around a meeting table if only 3 people are speaking in the meeting. We actually have to provide space for all of those perspectives to be heard so that they can inform decision making. And it doesn't have to be rocket science, and it doesn't have to be this totally dramatically different thing overnight. It can be small, simple tweaks to the things that we're already doing.
Yeah. At a personal level, one of the greatest compliments I can get from listeners of the podcast is when someone and it usually happens within the same week. Someone says, "Oh, Jim, I know you think like me and I know you agree with me." And then someone who has a diametrically opposed discussion says, "Jim, I know you think like me. So, I knew you agree with the way I view the world." Yeah, on this podcast, it's not our job to judge. What we want to do is study leaders. That's what we do. And we bring people out and, I want to hear every side of every opinion and I want to find out what's going on. As we've had people talk about issues like this, we've had a lot. It's not uniform. There's not a uniform position on this. There are some very different opinions. And I can see how some of the opinions are more polarizing than others. And, here's my judgment. I'll pass this. This is probably the least polarizing, most common sense approach I have seen on issues of fairness in the workplace. And I think that, this is just a discussion I find very fascinating because of
Thank you.
not the idea being different, the presentation being just on point.
Well,
Yeah.
I mentioned I'm a behavioral scientist, and so I'm passionate about behaviors. The other thing Iris and I are both very passionate about is results, which is why the subtitle of the book is Data-Driven Design for Real Results. One of the things that I've observed is in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been an unprecedented amount, as you both had said, of money and time and attention, effort spent on DEI or whatever we want to call it. And the results haven't always been there. So just as you were saying a moment ago, Jim, that you feel like your job is not to judge, right? As a social scientist, my job isn't really to tell people what they should think or what they should care about. I see my job as being to study if we want to achieve A, what works and what doesn't. If we want to achieve B, what's the best way to get there? And then those people who want to achieve A and B will find a sort of practical and concrete roadmap in this research. But I often get asked, what if I have this senior leader who just doesn't get it? They don't seem to care about fairness. Siri, how can I get them to care? I kind of have to say that's where we run to the limits of my expertise, because we haven't really discovered ways to force people to care about things that they fundamentally
I think
care
that's the
about.
heart of. I think you just, and we're at the end of the podcast, but I think that's the heart of it, because if I were to ask all my clients, hey, what do you hear in culture? What normally they would say is, people need to feel more appreciated.
Mhm.
That's kind of how they would summarize it. I just don't think any of my clients would go, we've got to work on fairness. But I do remember one podcast we had with Ron Carucci, where I loved what he said. He said, you don't want people to ever ask these two questions. Do I matter and do I belong? And I really think if we make sure we create a culture where people matter, they're appreciated,
Yeah.
and that they belong. And again, what surrounds that is fairness, of course. And again, the whole idea is, you're working toward results. You grow your people, you grow the company.
Yeah.
But
Can I attempt to make a quick connection between
I would
fairness
love
and
it.
appreciation?
And also wrap in what you would love to throw out as a closing remarks for
Oh,
our listeners. That'd be great, Siri.
absolutely. I doubt that there's an organization out there in the world where either everyone or no one feels appreciated. I think most organizations are in the middle. So when they say, we're hearing from our employees that they need to be more appreciated, the question is, who already feels appreciated here and
That's good.
why?
That's
And
good.
who doesn't yet and why? And
That's
that's
good.
where fairness comes in, right? Just like career advancement, some people might feel like they're languishing and some people might be languishing, but others are somebody somewhere is getting promoted. So then we got to look at, why is it happening and is it happening fairly? On that note, my closing thought would be to invite everybody listening to think of your daily existing work and one thing that you could tweak just slightly to maybe make it more fair. Maybe you start leading your meetings differently. Maybe you do an audit of, if you're a manager, of your the feedback that you're giving your team to make sure that everybody's getting the same amount of high quality, thoughtful feedback and that no one is falling through the cracks. Something small that you can start to change.
Yeah. And
Right.
taking it right back to asking the right question. Siri, thank you for being on the show. This has been a real pleasure and a treat for us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Jim and Jen.
Yeah. For our listeners, that's all we have for you this week. You can find everything you need to find out about us and Siri on theleadershippodcast.com. And remember, though force can protect in emergency, only justice, fairness, consideration, and cooperation can finally lead men to the dawn of eternal peace. Dwight D. Eisenhower. It's a wrap.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Podcast. To listen to more shows or to access the books and content discussed on this show, be sure to visit theleadershippodcast.com. The material in this podcast is copyright by Rafti Advisors and Self-Reliant Leadership and must have written approval before commercial application.